I've spent some time considering this, about 10 years now, well, maybe 8 years now. I'm just going to repeat what I said. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. And that's anywhere. And so we are all involved in this, whether we like it or not. Because when it happens to somebody else, it happens to us, or it could be happening to us, or maybe it has happened to us, or maybe it will happen to somebody that we know. And maybe that's going to be on a grand scale like in Rwanda, or maybe it will just be something in our own classroom. The DNA of that is exactly the same. It isn't the same event. And we must not confuse the same events, and we must not compare human suffering, because human suffering cannot be compared. How can I say what you feel, or you feel, or you feel compared to me? I don't know what you feel and what you experience, and how dare I compare one suffering to another? But the causes and the consequences absolutely must be. That's if we care about humanity. That's if we care about anybody other than ourselves. That's if we really care about our own children and our own grandchildren. The answer to that is not, I will protect myself, but I will speak out on behalf of everyone. Because we absolutely rely on everybody else. The Jewish community of Europe had a very difficult and disappointing experience. Because we know that actually during that period of increasing anti-Semitism and the legalization of genocidal policy through the 1930s, which the Nazis were purposefully creating, there was silence. This very silence that Anton referred to, that Martin Niemöller realized all too late. And how brave of him to realize it as late as it was, and to state it for our benefit, that there was no one left to speak for me. Genocide is about silence, not about violence. It's about silencing communities. It's about silencing families. It's about silencing individuals. So the resistance to genocide is speaking out. It's giving voice. It's providing an opportunity to speak and to be heard. You might think that the 2.9 million people that are in refugee camps right now in Darfur and Chad can't hear you. They have mobile phones. And they tweet. And their relatives are on Facebook. And they know when we speak. And they absolutely know when we're silent. I remember speaking to Naomi Blake, survivor of Auschwitz, sculptor, and I wanted her to create a sculpture for the garden at the Holocaust Centre in the UK because she'd never done a piece about her own experience. She created a piece called Abandoned. It was a kind of a hoop, and in there was a tall, dignified figure. Supposed to be androgynous. I think it was more female than male. Maybe it was her, actually. I don't really know. It was called Abandoned. I said, Naomi, it's a beautiful piece. What's the story? She said, well, the image of the victims of the Holocaust is the Muslim, the broken, diseased, starving person that's the end of their life. She said, I want to tell you that I never, ever lost my human dignity, even when I lost my strength. And so she's standing tall with all her human dignity, and wrapped around her the words from the Psalms, wherefore hidest thou face and not look upon our afflictions. She was also from a Hasidic family. She'd never questioned God until the moment she put it on that text. But she said, in this case, she said, it's not only the God, the deity, it's the God of humanity. And we all felt abandoned. If only we'd known there was a voice. 1993, Steven Spielberg was in Poland creating Schindler's List. There was a set set up just outside Auschwitz-Birkenau, and on the set there were a number of Holocaust survivors who were there to help. Their role there was to kind of give some advice in terms of what was happening in terms of this, what was it, and the historical integrity of the image. Were the dogs there? Were the guards there? How did it look? Is this looking right? Does it feel right? Stephen was very, very careful to make sure that he got this right. So the survivors are there to try and help that. One day, one of the Holocaust survivors came to him and said, "Mr. Spielberg, I don't want to just tell you about this day in my life. This was just one day in my life, the day I arrived at Auschwitz. I want to tell you my whole story." Steven Spielberg created the Shoah Foundation, which I know a number of you here volunteered for or have given testimony for, and for all the work you did here in Australia to create the 2,500 testimonies that were taken in Australia of Holocaust survivors. Thank you. And to the Sydney Jewish Museum for housing them and making them available also to the public here. Thank you. 52,000 Holocaust survivors in 56 countries in 32 languages gave testimony, which means we can teach in Ukrainian schools in the Ukrainian language with survivors that live in Kiev or Lvov or places like that. But the testimony is so much more than a historical account. People ask me very often, "Stephen, why do you work for an archive when you've been involved in all this advocacy work and genocide prevention and going around the world and doing all this stuff? Why an archive?" And the answer very simply is this: it's not an archive. We have an archive. But it is the voice of conscience of our age that can speak to our age about what is possible, what has happened and what can happen. Moreover, though, it's an act of resistance. Each survivor that gave their testimony did not only give their life history, but they gave a part of their life. Well, 52,000 Holocaust survivors spoke about 1.2 million people, because of course they talked about their mothers and their fathers and their brothers and their sisters and their children and their grandchildren. 1.2 million names. If the Nazis' intent was to obfuscate the names of those who were murdered, the survivors themselves put those names back into history. If the intent of the Nazis was to wipe out their community and their life and their ancestors and their traditions and their synagogues and their youth movements and their clubs and their political movements, these 52,000 people have written them back into history. It overcomes the intent of the Nazis themselves. It's not an archive. It's an act of resistance. It overcomes what the Nazis intended. But what's amazing about all of that is it's also a wonderful educational tool for the children of the future, because every single one of those 52,000 people can say what racism is and what racism does and why we must avoid it. 52,000 people. Are some of them angry and bitter about what happened to them? Some of them are, with very good reason. But most of them, in fact the overwhelming majority of them, say, "I know what hatred is. Do not hate. I know what racism does. Do not allow it. I know what genocide does. It has to be stopped." And they say it over and over and over and over again. It is the voice of conscience. I don't know where my conscience is, whether it's in my heart or my head or my bones or where I learnt it from, whether it's from my parents or from school or from my religion. These things I don't really know, but I know what's right and I know what's wrong. And somehow this voice of conscience, if it's deeply embedded in our society, in our conscience, in the way we act, in the way in which we think as political entities too, then when we see it, something tells us this is not right, and it demands my voice. Today, we face racism right around us, all of us, every day in some way or other. It may not be glaring, it may not be violent, but we do see it, we do hear it, we know it's there.